So, welcome. Good morning. Those of you who've heard me talk before, you've heard me mention how I'm a disaster ghoul. One of the things I'd like to tell you about, a little detail I'd like to tell you about is that 28 years ago, almost to the day, I was actually running a disaster field office in Thibodaux, Louisiana, because there was some kind of flood going on. We were pouring a lot of water. We'd begun pouring a lot of water down the Atchafalaya Basin so as to save Baton Rouge in New Orleans. And my job was actually to work with the thousands of people who live in the Atchafalaya Basin, figure out which ones of them had lived in standardized housing, which meant, according to HUD, with plumbing, and were therefore eligible for housing assistance, meaning they could actually get federally supported housing since they had been flooded out. Now, since there's no one from HUD likely here, I will tell you that's when I learned one of my basic operational principles. 'Tis easier to seek forgiveness than permission. So in my little pea brain, it seemed to me that if a social goal was to get people into standardized housing, why wouldn't you expose people to plumbing and maybe they would just decide that they like plumbing? Now, there are not a lot of people in the Atchafalaya Basin who have plumbing, but on my watch, they did. We put a lot of people in apartments. Now, I don't know how many of them actually went back to living in their shack down the bayou that required a boat to get to and no plumbing, but I felt like I was doing some good. Now, it was probably only very marginal and probably only for a short time, but like I said, it did inculcate a principle in me, and since the statute of limitations has expired, I thought I'd tell you about it. The other thing I found fascinating during that time was I-10 had just been completed, but it wasn't actually open for traffic. So I would use I-10 like my personal freeway, just drive around the barricades and drive on I-10. And it was amazing to drive on I-10 as the sun was rising and the whole roadbed was shaking from the force of the river. I can still have that feeling, you know, just that they had laid a solid layer of pile driving for the whole of the causeway across the Atchafalaya Basin, and it was still shaking from the force of the water. So I can only imagine when I-10 is shaking like today, because it's a greater volume and it's going to be a greater velocity than it was in '73. So this is an historic time, once in our lifetime. I guess that means my lifetime's almost done. Okay. Anyway, one thing that is constant in our world is, in fact, change, and Chad kind of alluded to it. One of the things that we're already seeing is more frequent and more severe extreme events. Hot, cold, wet, dry. It's going to be bad. And the severity of the drought increases the severity of the flood. And these things have a nice little cycle. The other thing, of course, that is changing is our demographics. We just got in the 2010 census. Si hablo español? If not, you're SOL, and that's not Spanish. Okay. So we're changing both culturally, and we're changing in terms of our age structure, we're changing in terms of the density of our communities, and certainly our economic patterns are changing, right? We're less manufacturing, more service, but we already knew that. But we continue to be dependent upon natural resources for a good portion of our economy. Drill, baby, drill. Even as we're trying to figure out other things. All these things that are changing around us, and our politics have changed. What happened in just the last few years? I'm not sure what happened, but one thing that's pretty clear to me is that since we're going to be changing our congressional districts based on the recent census information, I suspect the politics that we have right now are going to at least be with us for the next decade, which means life is, if nothing else, going to be interesting. So we have changing budget realities as well. So everything is changing around us, including Mother Nature. And has our ability to understand and get ahead of that change itself improved? I think that's the big question that we have to understand and talk about a lot. And how do communities look at risk now and in the future? One thing that's clear is that how we perceive and act on risk is very geographically and culturally specific. So it becomes even more incumbent upon us not just to understand the physics of our environment or even the chemistry of our environment. We actually have to understand the social interactions in our environment. Some of you have heard me make the joke at the expense of my colleagues in the Weather Service. We can nail the storm track, and we're going to spend another $100 million. Well, actually, that was last year. We thought we were going to spend another $100 million on understanding hurricane intensity. Maybe it's not $100 million. Maybe it's only $20 million now. But we're going to spend a lot of money better understanding hurricane intensity, but we still can't get people to listen, right? Max Mayfield had to call up the mayor of New Orleans and tell him to get the people the hell out of Dodge on Sunday morning. What was that about? Particularly since we had a national drill called PAM just a couple of years ago that envisioned just such a scenario, and yet we had to replay it real time. And frankly, we didn't do as well in the real drill as we did in the pretend drill. So we have these challenges, or what Paul Newman said in Cool Hand Luke, what we got here is a failure to communicate, right? So we have a lot of agencies at the Fed level who are trying to figure out how to put their arms around this. One of the things that fiscal austerity does for us, at least at the Fed level, is it begets a greater interest in collaboration. I haven't got any money. Have you got some money? Maybe we could figure out how to work together. And I think that is happening, and I think it must happen. It's too bad we had to wait till we didn't have any money for it to happen, but whatever, all change is good if you figure out how to take advantage of it. The other thing we have to do is figure out how we take advantage of not only effective organizations like ASFPM and NEMA, but how we also embrace some new players on the scene, and I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things that's very clear to me, and I know Sandra Knight and I've talked about this a good bit, and I've talked about this some with my buddies at the Corps as well, how do we synchronize our communications? How do we do a better job of messaging, not just to OMB, but that's really important to us Feds, but how do we reinforce and add value to one another's activities? We have different missions, we have different obligations, we produce different kinds of tools and products. How do we figure out how these things interact up front, not after the fact? And I think that's beginning to happen, and that's very good. I myself am really heartened to see the Weather Service embracing social science data. I'm looking forward to other agencies recognizing that that's really good. I'll steal a thunder from Craig Fugate. I think it's really important that we embrace social media. Actually, I have a resolution in 2011 to figure out how to use Twitter myself, although Facebook was enough for me in 2010. One of the things I think we also have to recognize is the increasingly important role that the private sector plays, that NGOs and community-based organizations and civil society organizations play. In fact, I think one of the things that Feds could do in conjunction with groups like ASFPM and NEMA is I think we need to begin hosting some community salons to talk about what our perceptions are about risk, the perceptions of risk, the costs of risk now and in the future, and how do we as a community remember that individuals have to take some responsibility for their risk. Clearly, the Feds and the cavalry aren't necessarily going to be the first in to save us. So how do we, in fact, actualize and give power to community-based organizations, neighborhood organizations, to actually take the right kinds of steps with the right kind of information? I think having this all against the backdrop of the flood in the Mississippi River and talking about ecosystem services, which is how I think about this topic, is really important, because one of the things that we've kind of lost, we were talking about this at breakfast, you know, we kind of lost the reality that floods actually make for better agricultural lands. I mean, if I'm growing timber or I'm growing pot in the Atchafalaya Basin, I'm actually going to be a lot happier a year from this flood than I am right now, because those soils are going to be enriched. And yes, they grow it there too, not just in the national forest. But one of the things that we don't understand at almost any level of government is what is the value of ecosystem services. And we certainly don't understand it well enough to sell it to the Office of Management and Budget. And for your non-feds out, those are the people in D.C. that hold all the Fed agencies by the, the place that when you squeeze hard, it really hurts. So OMB, we have to do two things with OMB. As a community, we have to get OMB to think about redefining cost-benefit analysis. The current OMB required definitions on cost-benefit analysis do nothing but hem in the imagination of my colleagues at the Corps and at many other regulatory agencies. We also have to get them to understand that there is an intrinsic value in the enhancement of ecosystem services like flood attenuation. Now, we're getting ready to embark upon a massive restoration effort in the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the things I think is very clear is we have to figure out how we're going to do landscape scale restoration to enhance ecosystem services, not just single criteria boutique restoration like we have been doing for the last 20 or 30 years. Anybody here from Louisiana, or are you all home tending to the flood? Anybody from Louisiana? Ah, yes, the BRO Act. We've spent $100 million, and what do we have to show for it over the last 20 years? Thank you, I agree with you. He was shaking his head no. So I think you need to pay attention to that issue, that big restoration issue, and how do we get the valuation of ecosystem services right, and how do we get restoration to enhance functionality right? Because that's what we need to do, not just in the Gulf, but everywhere. Okay, I'll wrap it up here soon, Doug. I saw that.